Hello again. Welcome to another video series. This time we are looking into the development of the fringes of empire in the Atlantic world. We're going to be talking specifically about the colonial empires developed by French, Dutch, Swedish, and English settlers in North America, especially throughout the 17th century. Just a very brief disclaimer now. Just as in the case with the Aztec, Inca empires and the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish videos, the purpose of this is not for you to memorize and learn every single name, every single date, and every single political entity that we're going to mention ahead. The purpose is to really try to convey the nuances, the very complex nature of the colonial experience in the Americas in the 17th century. So feel free to pause, take notes, and most importantly, just relax, enjoy the ride, and don't try to remember every single thing. So with that said, let me dive right into it. With the very first presence of European settlers in the Americas. And that goes way back to the year 1000, where when we have Norsemen or Vikings led by Leif Erikson conducting expeditions to the Americas. And in fact, Viking presence or Norse presence in Newfoundland, in what is nowadays Canada, has been archaeologically attested because we actually have sites where we have presence of these European settlers. However, these were not settlements that managed to develop long-term, that is centuries-long interactions between the Americas and Europe. These pre-Columbian links between Europe and the Americas would not be as stable as those developed afterwards. And the Norse settlement in North America would disappear and would only be rediscovered later on. But after the Vikings, the other seafaring peoples that were making forays closer and closer to the American coastline were actually the Basques, who were very successful in their whaling operations, and seasonally they would venture further into the Atlantic Ocean. And this started all the way since around the year 1000, but really came into a peak between 1200 and 1600, where Basque whaling came to its most relevant point in history. That's the reason why you actually see a lot of whales depicted in the seals of various towns and communities in the Basque Country, both on the Spain side of the Basque Country and the French side of the border. So the Basques were later joined by the Portuguese, and together Basques and Portuguese actually developed a very vibrant whaling community where they would come seasonally, land on the coast of Newfoundland and other areas in the St. Lawrence Bay area. They would then catch the whales and other animals they were fishing and then carry them back, but they wouldn't establish permanent settlements. However, the fisheries there were a major source not only of whale-derived products, but also cod fish. And in fact, you can see pictured here in the very foreground of this image, you can see codfish. Cod became a vital part of the diet in both Portugal and in the Basque Country. Salted cod became a mainstay in supplies first for long seafaring travels, and later on for plantations, in particular to feed slaves in the American colonies. So the salting of cod was a vital part of the colonization of the Americas. But if we're talking about permanent settlements, then we need to look at the British the English, who first launched an expedition of exploration and colonization under Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, who commissioned John Cabot, who was actually as an Italian sailor from Venice, to explore the American coast. And he actually arrived in Newfoundland in 1497. He was followed after many years by Humphrey Gilbert, who actually tried to develop the very first permanent settlement in Newfoundland. Up to that point, Newfoundland, like I said, was only a seasonal staging ground for Basque, Portuguese, and later French, English, and Dutch fishermen. But Humphrey Gilbert actually tried to settle the colony, and he proclaimed Newfoundland as a domain of the Queen of England. But he never settled on the island himself. That would only happen in 1610 when John Guy actually founded the very first settlement. They had a really, really rough winter because, of course, the American side of the Atlantic is way colder than the European side. The European side is actually warmed up by the Gulf Stream current that flows from the Caribbean to Europe, whereas the American side of the coast is actually quite harsh, especially in the dead of the Little Ice Age in the 17th century. So, however, exploration of the North American coast was also driven by the hope of finding a navigable route into the Pacific and further on to Asia, into the Spice Islands and China and Japan and India. And that passage was called the Northwest Passage. It was supposed to be located somewhere in the Northwest Atlantic and connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific Ocean. There were various expeditions trying to find this Northwest Passage. One of them is Martin Frobisher's expeditions in the 1570s. He was trying to find this route to Asia, and he also came across this strange ore which he thought was gold. So he managed to get a lot of funding from the Queen of England, and when they actually came back with all the ore they had mined for months in the very cold, barren coasts of Baffin Island, which is now part of Canada, they actually realized that this was not gold. It's actually fool's gold, iron pyrite, so totally worthless. But this thirst for gold and riches fueled British exploration of the Americas in the same way as the supposed thirst for gold and riches that is very common to see when discussing the Spanish explorers and settlers. So this was also the case with the English colonizers. So this is the supposed route of the Northwest Passage. Of course, this passage does not exist, so they never found it. Frobisher did become the first European since the Vikings to come into touch with the Inuit people of northwestern Canada. And speaking of Canada, Jaques Cartier was another explorer who actually settled in what is nowadays Canada. He set out various expeditions along the St. Lawrence River, expecting that the St. Lawrence River was this passage, this Northwest Passage that would lead him to the Pacific. It wasn't. However, he did come into contact with various natives on the shores of the St. Lawrence, whose villages were called by them Kanatas. And that's one of the possible origins of the name Canada. Cartier was actually told by the natives in the area that there was a big kingdom called Saguenay, somewhere in the wilderness, somewhere in the interior, but he, of course, would never find it. This was a sort of El Dorado kind of place that is actually mythological. It never existed. So Cartier's settlement on the St. Lawrence River would eventually succumb to scurvy and attack from the native peoples. However, the colonization of Canada would resume France did not attempt a lot of colonization in the Americas in the 16th century, mostly because it was in a period of time where France was in the midst of a very violent religious civil war between the Catholics and the Protestants. So nothing really happened before 1600. And in 1608, Samuel de Champlain actually returned to the St. Lawrence River and founded the settlement of Quebec in 1608. Now, he and his companions had a very harsh time. He actually wrote that you don't know Canada until you spend the winter in Canada. So did not have the best of times. He, however, managed to establish diplomatic relationships with various groups, especially the Huron and the Algonquin, and actually accompanied the Algonquin in a military expedition against the Iroquois, which was another polity that we will talk about a little bit in the future. He famously shot a musket in front of a column of Iroquois warriors, killing 2 of them. And so by providing the Huron and the Algonquin with French protection, he was able to secure a source of fur for the Quebec colony. And actually, fur was the resource that enabled the establishment of Quebec and its viability as a colony, because fur, in particular beaver fur, had become a prime product in Europe, because hats that were made from felt out of these fur hides became all the rage, became a very important fashion item in Europe, all across Europe, including Spain, but also the Netherlands, and obviously, of course, in France. People would wear them as a mark of distinction, mostly, obviously, rich people in the nobility or the merchant classes. So these beaver felt hats became a very important source of wealth for the little colony of Quebec, making it actually a viable colony. It did not become a very populated colony, but at least it was stable. So with this, Champlain was able to establish this permanent colony that was later known as New France. New France, also Canada. So it was a colony along the St. Lawrence River that depended on its ties to various Native American groups for supply of pelts, especially beaver, but also fox and deer and other animals for export into Europe. Now, the French did pursue a policy of religious uniformity. So no Protestants were allowed. After the Edict of Nantes, Protestantism was actually allowed in France, but the Protestants were not allowed to migrate to the colony of New France. So only Catholics were allowed. Furthermore, the Jesuits arrived with the intention of converting the Algonquin and the Huron peoples. They actually managed to convert some people, but mostly they managed to spread disease among the Native Americans. Smallpox, or the First Nations, smallpox in particular killed a very large portion of the local population. However, the Jesuits did record their journeys, and their ethnographies gives us a little bit of insight into life and how these people groups organized themselves at the time. So New France was articulated between 2 major outposts, Quebec, and then the city of Montreal, which was originally founded as a utopian Catholic city where righteousness would be the most important aspect of life, and where the native population could go and find Catholicism and convert. Later on, Montreal, of course, this did not live up to this righteous religious purpose. It just became another trading settlement that based its economy around the exchange of furs with the natives in the inside country. So that was the major French area of settlement. Now, population expanded slowly, but the French continued to explore the interior, finally reaching the Ohio and the Mississippi River basins. And in 1682, Robert de La Salle, a French explorer, reached the mouth of the Mississippi in the Gulf of Mexico and proclaimed that the entire area was the territory of King Louis XIV, and proclaimed it as the Louisiana. We've already mentioned de La Salle when we were talking about the Natchez communities of the Mississippian tradition. So here is the French taking over this long established roots, riverine roots that we talked about in our very first video. So part of the reason why the French had to go around and establish themselves in the Ohio and the Mississippi River basins was the fact that the Iroquois were a confederacy of 5 nations, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawk, and they were the strongest group in this area of North America, and they were staunch rivals of the French and their Huron allies. Ever since Champlain shot the Iroquois chiefs on Lake Champlain, the Iroquois and the French had very, very strained relationships. So these 5 nations were linked together by a common government. They spoke similar languages, and they all lived in communal spaces where large extended families, clan-based groupings would inhabit large buildings called the longhouses. These were large wooden structures that could be as big as 100 meters in length. And there, people would gather, inhabit, and discuss various aspects of life. These clans were actually functioned as matriarchies, where the clans were headed by women who were called the clan mothers. And the clan mothers would appoint different chiefs for various purposes, warfare or just civil governance. And in other chiefs, the sachems, were actually named by the clan's mothers to be representatives of the various nations in the Haudenosaunee Council, which was the council of these 5 nations that governed the foreign policy of all these nations as a whole. So this is a type of representative government that is completely outside European development, and that existed for a long period of time among the Iroquois in North America. So with this form of government, the Iroquois, the 5 nations, were able to mobilize resources and mobilize manpower very effectively. And they used this capacity to extend their power. They almost succeeded in driving the French out of New France, as we will see in a later video about resistance to European colonization in the Americas and elsewhere in the world. But the Iroquois were also able to use this mobilization to turn against other Native American groups. And in fact, they were able to expand into a very large territory through a series of conflicts with other Native American groups that are called collectively the Beaver Wars, because these were conflicts that where the purpose was to establish power over fur generating areas to supply to European traders. Now, the Iroquois were able to do this thanks to this communal representative government, but also because they were supplied with firearms that they used against the French and their Indian allies, their Native American allies. Now, the firearms were not provided by the French, of course. They were provided by a different European power. And now we turn to other European powers that also established themselves in North America at this time. So the major suppliers of the Iroquois, especially early on, were actually the Dutch. So the Dutch actually had a relatively long presence in North America, where they established an entirely independent colony called the New Netherlands, entirely independent from other countries. So the New Netherlands was established when Henry Hudson, which is English, but was actually working for the Dutch East India Company, traversed the river that is now called the River Hudson in his honor, because he thought that this was, again, the Northwest Passage to the Pacific Ocean, and thus a route towards Asia. So the river, of course, is broad. It's a large river, but it does not reach the Pacific. So instead, the river became the main artery for fur trade of the Dutch with the Iroquois Confederation. You can see in this map. I love this map because you can see the paintings, the representations of the Native American fortifications and towns. You can also see various animals in the interior. So you can see the bears and the deer, and of course the beavers that all these people were going after. So the Hudson River became the major artery, and this was the New Netherlands. It was a profit-oriented community with two major outposts, Fort Orange, that later became Albany, which is nowadays the capital of the state of New York, and of course, further down south, New Amsterdam. And New Amsterdam, being a profit-oriented community, developed into a very diverse religious and social community. There was a place where even people of Jewish faith, of course, many diverse groups of Protestants were allowed to settle in and to live their lives. And along the Hudson River, a series of large farms, large estates developed around this time as well. Now, New Amsterdam, you can see it here. Of course, it resembles the Netherlands a great deal with the little buildings and the windmill. But was therefore a very diverse community, a very diverse place. Women here were allowed to have property in their own right, for example, which was really not the case in many other places in the world. The Dutch were imitated by the Swedes later on. The Swedes actually colonized the area a little further down south in the Delaware River. There was a short-lived fur trading outpost along this river, and there the Swedes were doing the same thing that the Dutch were doing in the Hudson River, that is trading weapons especially, but other European products in exchange for furs, this time not with the Iroquois, but with the Lenape Indians of the region. The establishment of this colony coincided with a period of great strength of the Swedish monarchy under King Gustavus Adolphus, to whom we will return when we discuss the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and the 30 Years' War in another video. Eventually, New Sweden, although it was a very successful colony, it was probably too successful. By the way, the most important fort was called Christina, after it's now the capital of the state of Delaware, after the Queen Christina, the daughter of Gustavus Adolphus. It was a very successful colony, but it was actually absorbed by New Netherlands in 1655. But only 9 years later, New Netherlands itself was absorbed by the British. It was conquered by the British. In the midst of the Anglo-Dutch wars that characterized Anglo-Dutch relationships in the middle of the 17th century, the king's brother, the Duke of York, was granted New Netherland as his own feudal possession. New Amsterdam thus became New York in 1664, and it was from then on administered as an English colony. But religious tolerance that had characterized New Amsterdam was maintained. In the hinterland, so beyond New York City, people continued to speak Dutch for many, many years. And in fact, the upper class or the landed elite of New York continued to have Dutch heritage for many years. In fact, the first president of the US that came from New York was called Van Buren. So he's descendant from this Dutch elite of the New York hinterland. So great estates continued to be established along the Hudson River, and the colony continued to prosper. The area between the Hudson and the Delaware River, that used to be part of the New Netherlands, were given by the Duke of York as a settlement of a debt to another person. He owed a lot of money to a person, and he gave this piece of land in exchange for settlement of this debt. Now, because this person was from the island of Jersey, this area became known later on as the colony of New Jersey. So that's how we have New York and New Jersey. But these, of course, were not the first British or English colonies in North America. In fact, 100 years before that, Sir Walter Raleigh, famous because of his piracy against the Spaniards, his role in defeating the Great Spanish Armada that almost conquered England during the reign of Elizabeth II. Elizabeth I, I'm sorry, he organized a series of failed attempts to settle a colony. This colony, especially the one in Roanoke Island, eventually didn't manage to survive the harsh conditions of colonization and eventually disappeared. So single people were not able to found these colonies until people started to develop chartered companies. So people started gathering resources into companies, and these companies would then get a charter from the king, a special permission or dispensation from the king to colonize a particular area in the Americas. And that chartered company system was the main financial instrument that fueled English colonization in the Americas from then on. So one of the earliest of these companies was founded in 1606 when James I chartered the Virginia Company. And this Virginia Company was later on subdivided into two, the Plymouth Company and the London Company. And the London Company finally established the first permanent English settlement on the American continent. And that's the township of Jamestown. And this is, in fact, the Jamestown that is featured in the movie Pocahontas, just to give you an idea of where we are, what we're talking about. This Jamestown settlement developed further. The people there were unsure exactly how this was going to become a viable colony, and it had very strained relationships with the Native Americans that existed in the interior. In fact, the colony was almost destroyed by the Powhatan chiefdom in 1622. The Powhatan chiefdom is the group where we have Pocahontas. So Pocahontas was a member of the Powhatan Confederation or chiefdom. It was nearly destroyed then, the Virginia colony in Jamestown in 1622. So the king decided to reorganize the colony and turn it into a royal colony in 1624. Now, the colony did attract some religious outsiders. We will see how religion played a major role in colonization of North America later on. Here's an image of how Europeans represented this Powhatan resistance, this Powhatan attack against Jamestown. We will turn back to the very difficult and strained relations that the European colonizers had all across North America in our series on resistance to European colonization. But here's just a little foreshadowing of that lecture. So the other colony, I mentioned that the Virginia Company had like two parts. The Plymouth Company tried to establish another colony further north, but further north the conditions were even harsher, and that colony eventually disappeared. It was completely abandoned. However, John Smith, and yes, this is the same John Smith, did name this area further north of the coast. He named it New England. And so New England became another major area for English colonization. But John Smith, who, by the way, was a completely different character than what Disney will have you believe, had really nothing to do with it. Instead, New England would be colonized by religious outsiders, by people who were fleeing from religious persecution in England. And we turn now to them. Now, one of these groups are the Puritans. Now, the Puritans it's a group within Protestantism that is based on Calvinist thought, and we will discuss this in a little bit more detail in our discussion of the European Reformation, Counter-Reformation, and religious wars. But for right now, it's just important for you to know that Puritans and Calvinism resisted established authority because they only recognized the authority of God. So whatever the king said, whatever the establishment was, there was always the authority of God above that. And they, on top of that, they considered that the Anglican Church, despite being a Protestant church, the Anglican Church was established by Henry VIII. You perhaps know this story. It was a Protestant church, but the Puritans believed that it was not Protestant enough, that it had a lot of trappings similar to the Catholic church. They had bishops, they had certain ceremonies, they had certain rites that were just too similar to Catholicism for the Puritans' liking. So they started trying to establish their own church beyond the Anglican Church. And this, of course, was illegal, because if you were born in England, you were a member of the Anglican Church, and you had to remain a member of the Anglican Church. So this was rather illegal. So a small group of Puritans, fearing persecution in England, got a patent from the Plymouth Company and established a colony in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620. So they were actually trying to establish a separate church, but they did not say they were going to establish a separate church. They were merely establishing a colony in the trappings of a Plymouth Company, just as a Virginia Company had been established. In the Americas, the Puritans sought to maintain their independence from the Church of England. That's why we call them the separatists. They were trying to establish their own ways. And centered in Boston, the Massachusetts Bay Colony benefited a lot from a large exodus of Puritans from England who were escaping prosecution back home, and in 2 decades, a lot of them crossed the Atlantic and established themselves in these American colonies. However, Puritan ideology made them to have or to foster tendencies to splitting of different congregations And this limited the capacity for the development of centralized government. So very early on, Boston, that was supposed to be a single city, a single place, a single Puritan colony, started having people leaving the city and establishing their own colonies across the New England area. So by the 1660s, divisions among Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Area gave way to the establishments of 5 other colonies: New Hampshire, New Haven, that was later absorbed by Connecticut, Plymouth, later absorbed by Massachusetts, and then Connecticut and Rhode Island. So New England was a common area where everyone was roughly Puritan, and some cultural traits existed, but politically it was a fragmented area. There will be attempts to make it a single colony, but in general, these were different separate colonies. Now, not only Puritans were seeking religious freedom in the Americas, we also have the case of the Catholics. Now, the first Lord Baltimore, that's why the capital is called that, the first Lord Baltimore converted to Catholicism and founded a colony on the Chesapeake Bay in 1632, and that colony is now the present-day state of Maryland, and the capital city is called Baltimore, in honor of this first Lord Baltimore. So Maryland became a colony where English Catholics could live left alone to their own devices and would no longer suffer prosecution from the English Anglican authority. Now, there were other extreme groups that settled in the Americas, and we need a little bit of context to understand exactly where these people came from. I'm gonna be very brief about this. After a bloody civil war, England deposed its king, and it became ruled by a Puritan, that is religiously Puritan, Republican government. And that is now the Commonwealth of England under Oliver Cromwell. And this republic, this English republic, lasted for between 1649 until 1660. And during this period, many radical Protestant churches, in particular Puritan separatist churches, flourished across England. One of these was called the Society of Friends. And this Society of Friends rejected not only secular, but also religious authority. So they would call churches steeple houses, so as not to give them like a grave meaning, right? They were trying to diminish the relevance of earthly trappings of authority. They would call each other friends or brothers or sisters, rather than establishing a very pronounced hierarchy among one another. They refused, for example, to remove their hat when they would greet figures of authority, because they would say they would not shake, they would not be frightful, they would not fear, they would not quake to anyone except God. Now, this idea that they didn't quake in front of anyone but God was the reason why these people became known as Quakers. They didn't call themselves Quakers, but others, outsiders, called them Quakers. So it was not a term of endearment. Now, Quakers became persecuted, especially after the Anglican Church was reestablished, when the English monarchy was restored and the Republic, the English Republic, ceased to exist. Now, the Quakers then started being oppressed, and they were unwelcome even in the New England Puritan colonies. In fact, Quakers that did not cease their religious practices were actually executed in the city of Boston. Those are the famous Boston martyrs. The most famous of them is Mary Dyer, who was executed in the Boston Common in 1660. Now, the Quakers did not disappear completely, even despite this suffering persecution. thanks in part to the fact that a British nobleman, William Penn, became a Quaker. And he used his political influence to lobby with the monarchy, with the crown, for recognition of the rights of the church. So he was pushing for the legalization of the Quaker church in England. He did not succeed. The monarchy was not ready to accept this very extreme form of religious practices, because they were very much against authority. So how could the king be safe that the Quakers would never turn against him? So instead, William Penn started to think about establishing a colony in the Americas. And the king acquiesced. He actually granted William Penn absolute feudal rights as proprietor of a new colony. And the king forced the name Pennsylvania in honor of William's father. Now, Pennsylvania, of course, is the woods of or the forests of Penn. And Pennsylvania was thus formed as a colony in 1681. The capital city, Philadelphia, in the same way as Montreal before and Boston before, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, was to become an ideal city governed by Quaker, pacifist, and tolerant principles. This, of course, never achieved this utopian view. In fact, Penn slowly relinquished his power to an elected advisory council. And a lot of people that lived in Pennsylvania were not actually Quakers. They were from various others Protestant groups. And you also have Jewish communities and even Catholics allowed to live in the city of Philadelphia. So this advisory council eventually separated when in 1704, the lower counties of the colony, those that were along the River Delaware, started organizing their own assembly. Oftentimes, Pennsylvania and Delaware shared a governor, but they were in fact separate colonies. Now, Philadelphia became the most tolerant city in the English-speaking world, and this made it a magnet to all sorts of people that were fearing persecution, or people who wanted to better the possibilities in life by emigrating to the Americas. So it became the most tolerant city, but it also became the second largest city in the British Empire by 1720, only after the city of London. So the largest English-speaking city after London was, in fact, Philadelphia. Now, the re-establishment of the British or the English monarchy had other effects in the Americas, not only Pennsylvania, but also in 1663, a group of wealthy noblemen organized another settlement that they would call Carolina in honor of King Charles II. Now, the idea was to found a new colony and profit from this colony, but interestingly, this was a space for political experimentation. They actually hired the English philosopher John Locke to develop the constitution of this new colony. And John Locke actually developed this political scheme where the Society of Carolina was to be arranged into a hierarchy, but within this hierarchy of different tiers of landowning elites, there were areas where political representation would take place. So he actually organized a sort of a representative oligarchy. So the landed elites were on top, but there was some room to maneuver. There were some areas for political discussion and for political advancement, and that was the colony of Carolina. It only became North Carolina and South Carolina in the middle of the 18th century. And finally, Georgia was the last colony, the last British colony to be established, was a very different experiment altogether. It was to be a space for poor, unwanted people, a space for them to better themselves and to achieve higher standards of living. His founder, Oglethorpe, established the colony of Georgia as an experiment in social charity, where the colony here, instead of being a representative kind of parliamentary type of form of government, here it was ruled by the trustees of the colony, who had absolute power. And they forbade, for example, the consumption of alcohol in the colony, because they claimed it would dull the senses of these people, these poor people who were supposed to better themselves through hard work and to lift themselves up from poverty. Here we have the image of the city of Savannah, Georgia. It's actually a planned city, and you can see how you can only achieve this sort of organization with a very established system of rules. So that's how Georgia was founded. And there we have the 13 colonies. Now, a lot of these colonies only became viable when they discovered different cash crops that grew really well in these places. For example, Virginia. Virginia did not become a stable, profitable colony until a particular strain of tobacco was found that could be produced very well and yielded very good results in the colony. So tobacco became a staple cash crop in Virginia, while rice and indigo, rice for export to the Caribbean colonies, indigo is a dye for various textiles. These were grown in Carolina. Now, both these crops, or these three crops, tobacco, rice, and indigo, require labor. And of course, very early on, this labor was supplied by African slaves that were imported into the colony. But we will get to that in more detail in our discussion of the Atlantic slave trade. Now, the 13 colonies, thus, are a hodgepodge of diversity. They come from very different historical origins. Some are charted, some are established by religious people fleeing from religious persecution. Others were established by traders, fur traders, taken over from different countries. But this world of the 13 colonies was a tremendously diverse political arena. Each colony was governed in a very different way, although to a certain extent, a lot of them shared certain instruments for political representation. They were also very diverse in terms of religious practices. A lot of them, some of them were Anglican. The Puritan colonies were congregationals because they congregated, so they had different rules there. Where there had been a serious number of Dutch and Swedish settlers. We had Lutherans. Later on, we had Presbyterian. So there was a variety of Protestant churches, and we also had the Catholics in Maryland. Then we also had Baptists and Dutch and Germans and French and Quaker churches. And then we have Jewish communities in Rhode Island, in Philadelphia, and in New York. So it was a very diverse religious community as well. And of course, it was very diverse in terms of its economic setup. Eventually, three major areas developed. New England, dependent on transatlantic trade and fishing and whaling. The mid-Atlantic colonies that were stable in terms of wealth, produced mostly through the trade of furs with the Native Americans in the interior, but also the establishment of great farms, estates, big farming estates, but not necessarily worked by slaves. Whereas the southern colonies, the southernmost colonies, Virginia, Carolina, and Georgia, these depended on cash crops, tobacco, rice, and indigo that were dependent on slave labor. So very quickly, this political, religious, and economic diversity leads to certain cultural diversity as well. So these three major regions. Okay, and thus going back to the big picture of North America and going back to the French, we have the interior of the continent dominated by France, very sparsely populated. Only about 50,000 Frenchmen live across Canada and Louisiana. So it's very, very sparsely populated chain of settlements and forts that linked the St. Lawrence River with the Great Lakes, and then the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. And in contrast, we have a very densely populated, close to 1 million people, 13 colonies, rivaling the French. And of course, we have a back and forth between France and first England and Britain, where finally France relinquished its claims over certain territories, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Hudson Bay, in favor of the British. So we have North America divided up between the French and the British. Further south, we have, of course, the Spanish possessions in New Spain and in Florida. And they will come into play a lot in the 18th century. So this was just a basic introduction to European colonization into North America. In a further lecture, in another lecture, we're going to examine how the presence of these Europeans shaped and Native American relationships, and how the Native Americans fiercely resisted the establishment of these new polities. So I'll see you in a couple of days for that. Thank you.